right here, right now. This is Right Time Reborn. We are a reboot of Right Time Radio, which ran for many years in Kingston, New York. It was the only conservative radio talk show between New York City and Albany for many years. And my name is Imra Becca. I am your host. And we are going to talk about politics today on this beautiful Florida day here in Central Florida. It's in the 70s. The sun is shining. You just got a little bit of a breeze. I was outside before, and wow, it is amazing. The past few weeks, this is the fourth episode, by the way. The past few weeks, we followed basically a straight radio talk show format where I talked to you about the news and gave you my opinions, my analysis of it. And we are going to get to some of that today. But before that, I'd like to go into a little bit of my background to tell you about where my family came from and why it is that I am so incredibly opposed to communism, to socialism, to authoritarianism, to all the ways in which the government takes away our freedoms and runs our lives. You know, this country is almost 250 years old. In about 3.5 years, we will be 250 years old. Quarter of a millennium. And for most of that time, this country has done a tremendous job of being the greatest nation, the freest nation on earth. But the past 50 years or so, a little more than 50 years, since the misbegotten 1960s, we have been on a path that destroys freedom, that takes it away from the individual, that puts power in the hands of the government. And you know, humanity has tried this before. We have tried systems where the government has all the power, the people have no power, government runs everybody's lives, and it's never turned out for the better. Not once has it been good. Not once. Every time it ends up being bloody, murderous, genocidal, full of torture and kidnappings and a lack of justice and a lack of freedom until people reach the point where they believe they have no other option but to rebel, to engage in revolution, to overthrow the government that is so tyrannical in their lives. You know, that's where revolutions come from. Revolutions don't come from people who want more freedom. It's never a question of desire. Revolutions come when people believe there is no other choice, that their freedoms have been so destroyed that if they don't revolt, they will end up dead. A revolution is an act of desperation, not an act of desire, not an act of patriotism. It is desperation. And we're moving in that direction. We're not there yet. And heaven willing, we won't get there. But that's going to be, to a large extent, up to us how we're going to stand up and tell the government, no, we will not. We will never give in to your tyranny. My family's story began with my grandparents on both sides of the family. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a newspaper editor. Before he became a newspaper editor, he and my grandmother, ethnic Hungarians, lived in a part of Hungary that today is Croatia. They lived down near the Adriatic shore, the Adriatic Sea, in a town at the time it was called Fiume. Now it's called Rijeka. And after World War I, many Hungarians were victimized. They had their property taken from them. That's what happened to my grandparents. They had several apartment buildings, and it was taken from them by the government. And so they went back up to what is Hungary today and started over from scratch. My grandfather was a businessman. He and some partners built a sugar plant, and he made some money at that. And then he helped start a newspaper and became the editor. During World War I, he was a man who just couldn't stand tyranny. He couldn't stand dictatorship. He couldn't stand the bullies who use the power of government to trample people. And so he wrote editorials during the war against both the Nazis and the Soviets. And not one or two editorials, series of editorials over and over and over again. And so when the Nazis invaded Hungary towards the end of World War II, they made a beeline for Budapest. It was a straight line going in there. They didn't have the entire country. They had probably maybe 15 or 20% of the territory of the country in their hands. And the rest of it was free of Nazi tyranny. My grandfather was just outside the city. He was in an area of the country that was not conquered by the Nazis. So they couldn't capture him, but they put him on trial in absentia. Well, that means we don't have that here in the United States. You actually have to have somebody arrested in order to try them. But in many countries, you can actually try somebody without arresting him, without having him in custody. And that's what they did to my grandfather. They tried him in absentia. He had no defense. There was no opportunity to make any kind of presentation of evidence. They simply declared him to be guilty. And they sentenced him to death. Luckily, they didn't have him in their hands. Just a few months later, the Soviets invaded Hungary from the other side, and they took pretty much the whole country. And they decided that they were going to try people like my grandfather, and they put him on trial in absentia. But by that time, he'd seen the writing on the wall, and he headed out of the country with my mother, who was 3 years old at the time, and my grandmother. And they were in Austria by the time he was put on trial in absentia. But he was again put on trial in absentia. And for a second time, he was sentenced to death. All because he opposed dictators. All because he wrote opinions, editorials, one after another, about why freedom was so important. And he put his own life on the line. And he endangered my family. And he ended up with my mother and my grandmother in what was called a displaced persons camp in Germany for many years after that. It was basically a refugee camp. It was, from what my parents tell me, it was bad. It was very bad. On the other side of my family, my grandfather was killed by Soviet troops. My grandmother was given a job in the Hungarian National Bank before the communists invaded, but she was told that she had to keep that job. You see, under communism, you were not allowed to be unemployed. You weren't allowed to choose your job. You were given a job, and that's where you stayed. And since she had that job already when they invaded, they told her, you have to stay with this job. A few years down the line, they moved her out of Budapest into another city. A city that was built brand new. It was called Stalinville. And they changed it since then. But originally it was named for Stalin. And during the war, before the Soviets invaded, once the Nazis came in, my grandmother joined the underground. She was a war widow, had a 3-year-old son, and she joined the underground. And she was part of a system that would hide Jewish Hungarians in ordinary people's homes. And they would stay in a home for a few days and then be moved to the next place and the next place. They wouldn't stay in one location for very long until they could actually be escorted outside of the occupied zone to an area where they were safe. And even though you had this underground system, the Nazis still shipped 450,000 Jewish Hungarians out of Hungary and into Auschwitz, where most of them were killed. And my grandmother did what she could to help people out. On one occasion, she had an older Jewish lady in her home. My father, as I said, was about 3 years old. And there was a banging at the door. The secret police were going from apartment to apartment, house to house in Budapest to see if anybody was hiding any Jews. And so my mother helped this old lady into the wardrobe. Now, they didn't have walk-in closets like we have today. They had wardrobes. There was a piece of furniture. It had legs. It had some doors on the front of it. It didn't hold very much as far as the amount of clothing. It was in the corner of the bedroom. She helped this lady get inside, arrange the clothing in front of her, closed the wardrobe door, sat my father, who was 3 years old, on the potty in front of the wardrobe and told him, if the men come in here, you start screaming and crying. Now, frankly, you don't have to tell a 3-year-old boy that if angry men in black uniforms burst into the room, that you need to cry. But she told him to do that. And when she opened the door, she started arguing with them. I am a war widow. My son is in the other room. He's hysterical. What's the matter with you? Why are you coming in here doing this? And when they went into the bedroom, my father started to cry and scream. And my grandmother got even louder with them. Look what you're doing. His father died for this country. And look what you're doing to this child. And they left. And my grandmother and my father, at one point, were about 6 feet away from being shipped off to the camps because she decided that she needed to do what was right. That doing what was right is more important than their own lives. My grandmother never told this story. My father told it. And he apparently had spoken with my grandmother about it several times as he was growing up, so he got a pretty good idea of what happened. But I remember asking my grandmother about this story one day when I was a teenager. And she looked at me and said, those were very dark days. We don't talk about them. That was the only thing I ever heard from her about that. My grandmother, along with my father, along with my grandfather on the other side, these are my role models. But in particular, this story about my grandmother, it stays with me. It's with me every day. This is the reason I am so adamant about fighting tyranny. And so my father grew up in that country. He didn't remember anything but tyranny. From the time he was about 3 years old to the time he was 15, all he saw was either Nazi tyranny or Soviet tyranny. And as I said, they moved my grandmother and my father to another city. She became the head teller at the Hungarian National Bank there. Now, when we say Hungarian National Bank, this was communism. There was one bank. You didn't have competing banks. There was one bank, and very few people had money to put in it. It was mostly about helping to run the financial system, the economy of the country. People didn't have a lot of money. It was a very, very poor country. But she was the head teller there in 1956 when the Hungarian Revolution broke out. Now, some people know a little bit about the Hungarian Revolution, but what they don't know is how it started. A lot of Americans don't have any idea of how it started. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but there was a protest in the center of Budapest against the government, against the Soviet occupation. It was in part a protest of solidarity because of some situations that were going on in Poland. And there were thousands of people gathered in this one square near the banks of the Danube, on the Buda side, on the western side of the city. And the Hungarian secret police were up on the rooftops and in the windows of the buildings surrounding that square. They never tried to clear the square. They never tried to disperse the crowds. They didn't go in there and arrest people. They simply opened fire from all sides. And when that happened, the people of Hungary had had enough. And they went out into the streets not to protest. For them, that was the moment of desperation. And a revolution broke out. And they picked up stones and sticks and pieces of rebar and beer bottles and wine bottles that they filled with gasoline and rags and lit them on fire. And as the revolution progressed, the actual police, not the secret police, but the actual police, joined the revolutionaries. And much of the Hungarian military, who were draftees, who were forced to be a part of the military, joined the revolutionaries. And believe it or not, the Soviet army was driven out of Hungary. It was the only time a revolution ever drove the Soviets out. Didn't last for very long, for a few days. October 23rd was the day the revolution started. By November 4th, the Soviets reinvaded with many times more tanks. And they cracked down on the revolutionaries. They arrested teenage boys, 13, 14, 15 years old, put them in jail, and kept them in jail until their 18th birthday. It doesn't sound so bad, 3, 4, 5 years in jail until their 18th birthday, except that they weren't released on their 18th birthdays. They were hanged. The Soviets were so afraid of children that they hanged these boys on their 18th birthdays. My father was part of that revolution. 15 years old, throwing hand grenades at Soviet tanks. Hand grenades that were supplied by the military, those members of the military who came over and became part of the revolution. And after the revolution, he helped hide guns and munitions, wrapped them in oil-soaked rags, and buried them on the banks of the Danube, so that if another revolution were to break out, they would know where to find the weapons they needed. 15 years old. 15 years old. In March of 1957, still 15 years old, he and his friends were in school one day. And the Soviets, as you know, communists in general, hate religion. They hate any mention of God. They hate Christianity. They hate Judaism. They hate the people who believe in God. And so there was a Hungarian folk song which contained a line that said, the song was about a young man who was being sent to the front lines to fight on behalf of his country, and he was saying goodbye to the girl he loved. And he said, "My sweet rose, God be with you. I have to leave you now." Soviets didn't like that song because it mentioned God. So they changed a folk song that was over a century old. They changed it to "My sweet rose, for the homeland I have to leave you now." Well, my father and his friends, they didn't like that. So in March of 1957, they went into school one day and began to sing the original version in gym class. And the gym teacher started to yell at them. Told them to sing the official version. Maybe you can hear the air quotes in my voice. And so my father and his friends sang all the louder. And they sang the original version, the true version. And they sang it again, and they sang it again. And the principal came and yelled at them, and other teachers came in, and they just kept singing. More and more students joined them. And this great Soviet evil empire is so afraid of children that they sent tanks to surround that high school. They sent tanks because children were singing a song. And my father was arrested. And my grandmother, being the head teller of the Hungarian National Bank, was able to get him freed on the condition that he returned for trial. And they gave her a letter. They gave my grandmother this letter that said, your son participated in a fascist conspiracy against the revolution. My grandmother, who by this time had been remarried and widowed once again, had 2 young children. My father was 15. My uncles were 2 and 4. She said to my father, that's it. We're done. We're leaving this country. We cannot stay here. And my father, being a teenager, a typical teenager, I will never leave this country. I will not give up. As my father tells the story, it was the last time my grandmother ever raised her hand to him. She slapped him across the face. Said, you will do as you're told. And that night, they got on a train. They went down as close as they could to the Yugoslav border. The area near the border was closed off because of the revolution, because so many people were leaving the country. And in the middle of the night, they snuck down to the border. And the border area had been dug full of holes. The holes, it looked like a gigantic chessboard. The holes were about 3 or 4 feet wide by 3 or 4 feet long, about 3 feet deep. And then the area in front of it was normal, and then there was another hole after it, and diagonally from each one there were holes. So it was this massive chessboard or checkerboard. And they spent the entire night going from one hole to another. As soon as a searchlight passed over them, they would go a couple of holes and then hunker down, waiting for the next searchlight. And this area was about half a mile or so. This is how they got down to the Yugoslav border and snuck through the barbed wire. And in Yugoslavia, they were escorted to a refugee camp where my father and his family spent the next year and a half living in one refugee camp or another, going from one to the other. They were constantly being transported around. My mother came to America in 1956 after 12 years in Germany. My father came to the U.S. in 1962 after about 4 years in Belgium. And they met here in the late 1960s. And they were married and had 4 children. My father was the head of the Hungarian American Federation for a long time, for many years. He's still a member of the board of directors at 81 years old. He's still active and involved in anything he can do to keep this country free. In 1989, the Iron Curtain fell as a result of Ronald Reagan's 8 years of being the American president, being the most powerful person on earth, being the man who forced the Soviets to spend more and more money on military investments, which bankrupted their economy. As a result of Ronald Reagan, the Iron Curtain fell. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down. My father started to travel to Hungary again. He had not been back to Hungary since 1957. More than 30 years had passed. He started to go there once a month for about a week at a time to help rebuild Hungarian society. He was a consultant in helping them open the stock market there. He owned businesses there. He was involved in helping the church revitalize itself. He became involved with the World Federation of Hungarians, which had delegates from over 40 countries, all focusing on rebuilding Hungary. In March of 1990, my brother passed away. He was a year younger than me. He had spent his entire life fighting a rare blood disease. And I couldn't remember being without him. And I didn't want to live in the house where we'd grown up. So I went to Hungary too, and I stayed. Enrolled in the law school there. My father maintained an apartment because of his constant traveling. It was very easy for me to go there. I wasn't quite 21 years old when I moved to a country that a year before was still behind the Iron Curtain. A lot of us here talk about tyranny. We talk about revolutions. We talk about socialism. We talk about communism. We talk about authoritarianism and statism and all the various things which we hate. But thank heaven, most of us don't actually have any real experience with those things. Until you walk down the streets of a city where there was a real revolution. A revolution where 14, 15-year-old kids were throwing hand grenades and firing guns and throwing Molotov cocktails. Until you look at the buildings there, which 30 years later were still pockmarked with gunfire from the 1956 revolution that was never fixed. The Soviets, the communists, never even tried to cover it up. They just left the bullet holes in the front of these buildings and their stone facades. Until you look at those bullet holes and wonder which one of them was made by a shot that went through somebody's body. Until you walk down to a river where you know that Nazis marched people down there just because they were Jewish, made them stand at the water's edge and shot them in the back of the head so they would fall in the river. Until you realize that the streets you walked on had also been walked by young men who were arrested at the age of 13 or 14 and hanged at the age of 18. Until you've lived in a beautiful city, centuries old, that was turned into a butcher's shop with blood running in the streets. Till you've had some tangible contact with tyranny, you don't really know what it is. You don't really understand. And this is not to denigrate anybody. This is not to belittle anybody's beliefs. Thank heaven that you've never seen those things. A part of me wishes I hadn't. I lived in that city. I went into the museum they built in the building that was used by the secret police. First by the Nazi secret police, then by the AVH, as they said in Hungary, the communist secret police, to torture people. They killed people there. I lived 5 blocks away from that museum, from that building. We don't want that to happen here in the United States. When I moved to Hungary, the first elections had already taken place. Hungary was no longer allied with the Soviet Union. It was just a few years before the Soviet Union actually completely fell apart as a country. But the Soviet military was refusing to leave. They didn't want to go back to Russia. Life was better in Hungary. And it took another year or so before Hungary was finally able to get them out of the country. And I walked down those streets where Soviet soldiers who had zero authority at that point were quote unquote patrolling. Men in their 20s in gray Soviet uniforms carrying Kalashnikov AK-47 rifles were stopping people. Documents. And whatever excuse they had to come up with, they did in order to quote unquote fine them. And they took their money. They were mugging people under color of fining them. And on 3 occasions I was stopped by Soviet soldiers. And when they saw my American passport, they let me go. But when you're 20, 21 years old, and angry Soviet soldiers with fully automatic weapons are yelling at you, it's not a fun experience. It's not a great experience. In Hungarian, the word we use for aunt, the word we use for uncle, doesn't just apply to the sibling of a parent or grandparent. It's anybody who is related to you who's from an older generation. So I had an aunt. In English, we would say she was my third cousin's mother. But I considered her my aunt. Her mother was my father's godmother. She got cancer. And Hungary to this day still has a socialized medical system. I don't know if that'll ever change. We heard a lot of talk during the debate about Obamacare about things like death panels and whether or not the government was going to ration health care. I don't know if that'll happen here, but it did happen over there. And my aunt, who was in her 70s, who had cancer, was denied treatment. They gave her painkillers, but they wouldn't treat her because she was too old. And she died. I had children born in that country under their socialized medicine system. When my first child was born, they had both a chicken pox and a flu epidemic at the same time, and they wouldn't allow me into the delivery room. My ex-wife had to have a scheduled C-section. I wasn't allowed to be in there. They put the epidural needle in wrong. And she felt everything. And when she screamed out in pain while they were cutting her open, the doctor told her to shut up. They put her in a room with 4 other women who had just given birth. She was there for about 3 days. The room was right across the hall from another procedure room, a room where they performed abortions. Mothers recovering from giving birth were watching women, pregnant women, go into a room across the hall to kill their children. I can tell you story after story after story about my experiences in Hungary. All that'll do is just reinforce what I've already said. Tyranny is a beastly philosophy or system. Despotism, dictatorships, they all come down to one thing. Your life is worth nothing. And what the dictators want is worth everything. That is the basis of every dictatorship. We can call them Marxist, we can call them Leninist, we can call them communist, we can call them Maoist, we can call them Ba'ath Socialist, we can call them social democratic systems, we can call them whatever type of socialism is in Venezuela. We can give them any name we want. We can call them Nazis and fascists. But they are all the same thing. They are all systems which have pronounced the quote-unquote truth that the state is everything and the individual is nothing. And when we say state, we're talking about the people who run it. Whoever the dictator is at the very top, whoever the people are who are closest to that person, they are the ones who run everything. They will tell you where you will work. They will tell you when you wake up. In some cases, they will tell you how many children you will have. They run everything. That is tyranny. That is the dictatorship. That is the direction certain states in this country are going. States like California and New York and Oregon. Those states are moving at breakneck speed towards tyranny. They are becoming third world locales. They're places which don't even want to let their people go. We had the Iron Curtain in Europe, where you wouldn't be allowed out. But if you're a wealthy person in California, technically you can leave, but they will keep taxing you. Because somehow, even if you've left, you owe them. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Many people are voting with their feet. Hundreds of thousands of people have left New York State. The population in Florida has exploded. The free state of Florida, the great state of Florida, the number one bastion for freedom in the United States, and therefore the number one bastion of freedom in the world, is this great sunshine state. And people are moving down here. But we can't take 332 million people. We can't take everybody who's going to flee. There's not enough space. So what happens in the rest of the country? Are people going to stand up and say no more? Are we going to create freedom in other states so that people who are leaving, conservatives, wealthy people, people who have had enough, who are leaving New York, who are leaving California, who will fit in philosophically in states which adore freedom, so that they will have a place to go? one of the opportunities we have for fighting back is if the people who compose the tax base in the most onerous of blue states leave and go elsewhere, and the economies of those states implode. They collapse. It will happen. And then things will have to be rebuilt in those states. But it will take time. And we'll have to somehow foster that in order to help people leave those states and bring their money with them. And states which are almost as strongly free as Florida will have to open their arms and invite in those who think like us, while making it clear that those who do not, those who like the systems in California and New York and Oregon and other such places, that they are not welcome. And we don't say they're not welcome by saying, hey, if you're a member of the Democrat Party, you can't move to Florida, you can't move to Texas, you can't move to Mississippi. We don't say that. We just create systems that are not friendly, that will not give them what they want. Here in Florida, we're seeing that. A few 100,000 Democrats have already left the state. A recent poll shows that LGBT, whatever the alphabet soup is, parents in Florida, over 50% of them want to leave the state. 17% have already begun to make preparations for leaving the state. That will give us homes that real conservatives can buy. It will reduce the number of Democrats in the state. It'll increase the number of Republicans. And we will continue to be that conservative state that is a role model to the entire country. That is what Florida will be. That is what the rest of the red states, the free states, have to be. It cannot just be one state. The free state of Florida cannot do this alone. We need others to join us and to pass laws that allow people to carry their firearms and defend themselves. Pass laws that tell teachers that their own personal political opinions need to be checked at the door and not brought into the schoolrooms. That they cannot force this nonsense, this trash down the throats of students. That college professors enjoy academic freedom, but that does not mean that they get to brainwash their students. That they don't get to use their classrooms as a captive audience with students who are afraid of what will happen to their futures because a failing grade from an extremist professor could derail their entire future. Those are the laws we are passing here in Florida, and we're making them stronger and better and more favorable to true freedom every day, every week, every month. Thank heaven for Governor DeSantis and for our 2/3 majority in both houses of the state legislature, and for their strength of will and strength of conscience in doing the right thing. We can't do it alone. We need the same thing from other states because we don't want this country to become a new Soviet Union, exporting vicious, bloody, murderous socialism to the rest of the world. This country, even with the problems we've accumulated over the past 50 years, we are still the greatest, most free country in human history. And we have to become a more free and more great and more strong. And yes, We need to become advocates for true freedom throughout the world. And I don't mean we need to go there and fight wars every time something breaks out. But there are many things we can do to encourage freedom without engaging in military activities, without going to war. Yeah, there's plenty of times we'll have to go to war. War is part of the human condition. It's not optional. But we don't need to go every time. And we can avoid many wars in the future by promoting freedom throughout the world through non-military means today. And that will also strengthen us, because the more free nations there are, the fewer enemies we will have. The less chance there is for a new Soviet Union to rise up. That is where I've come from. That's the background I've come from. That is the sum of the life lessons I've learned regarding freedom. And here in the United States, we have an entire political party dedicated to overturning our freedoms. The Democrats, our homegrown Sandinistas, a party which at one point had a whole lot of conservatives in it and is now dominated by extremist leftists, by people who are no better than Fidel Castro and Daniel Ortega and Erich Honecker and Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong and Lenin and Khrushchev and Mussolini. Because all they want to do is take away your freedom. There's an example. This week, the House Judiciary Committee announced that they were going to hold a crisis hearing in Arizona about what's going on at the border. And what do the Democrats do? They announced that they are going to boycott this hearing. They're calling it a stunt. It's not a stunt. You go where the problem is if you want to find out what the crux of the problem is. But they don't want to understand the basis of this problem. They don't care, because they want to bring in people who they believe they can fool into voting for them if they turn them into citizens. They're trying to import voters. It's literally what they're doing. They are importing voters. I don't know whether it'll work. I don't know if those people that are coming in here would end up being Democrat voters or not. What I do know is they are breaking the law. They're coming into this country without a visa. They are breaking the law. And those who come into this country in contravention of our law, in a violation of our national will as expressed through our congressional representatives who made those laws, those are people we do not need here. Not because of their ethnicity or skin color or the language they speak or any other discriminatory factor, but because they are lawbreakers. And we don't want them, and we don't need them. They do not belong in this country. My grandfather, my grandmother, my mother waited for 8 years before coming into the United States because they were denied permission due to a spot that was found on my grandfather's lung, which they couldn't tell whether it was tuberculosis or not. So it took 8 years for them to decide this is not tuberculosis. My grandfather did not try to come here illegally and bring his family with him. On my father's side, my grandmother and my father applied for asylum in Europe. They didn't come here illegally and then apply. They applied over there. And they waited until they were approved. And until then, they stayed put where they were. Because that is what people who truly love the country they want to move to do. They don't spit on the laws. They don't trample on the national will. They accept the situation as it is and wait patiently and peacefully to be permitted to join that society. America welcomes people with open arms from all over the world. We are a nation which has been made stronger by legal immigration. And we will be strengthened by legal immigration in the future. But when people come here illegally, when people decide that they don't care what our laws say, those people weaken our country. And it doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter whether they come from Mexico or Ireland or Italy or Peru or China or wherever. If you come here illegally, you weaken America. If you come here legally, you strengthen America. That is the basis of the way in which we created our immigration system. And we have to maintain that strength. Part of our struggle to right this country again, to bring us back to a good path, is how we choose our presidents, and especially the next few presidential elections, next 2 or 3, are going to be crucial. Not too long ago, a few days back, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley announced her candidacy for President of the United States. And apparently, Democrats don't like people like Nikki Haley. I don't know if they don't like her because she's a woman, or they don't like her because her parents are from India, or they just don't like her because she's a strong conservative. But Don Lemon, the CNN announcer, CNN host, said that Nikki Haley is, quote, past her prime. Past her prime. A lot of CNN viewers and even many of the insiders are angry at him. One insider said that everyone's annoyed. People are definitely upset about it. This man supports a president who is in his 80s. And yet a 51-year-old woman is, quote, past her prime. Are you kidding me? His co-host shot back. Prime for what? Nikki Haley is past her prime. Prime for what? And the only answer Don Lemon had was Google it. And he said, don't shoot the messenger. Excuse me? You drop a bomb where you want to discriminate against a woman who is 51 years old, who is certainly more intelligent and more articulate and more charismatic than our current president, and more capable of running the country. By the way, she is not my first choice. I am fully and 100% in the camp of Governor Ron DeSantis. I want to see him become president in 2025. But Nikki Haley is a competent woman, a competent leader. She's got foreign policy experience, having been a United Nations ambassador. She is arguably far more capable of being president than Joe Biden. And so, because she seems to be a threat, the Democrat host pronounces her as being past her prime. I don't know about that. All I know is that we're looking at a president who certainly can't claim to be in his prime. Joe Biden just had his health evaluation, and it's missing a mental status exam. He's been facing questions about his age and mental capacity since coming into the White House. He stood up at a podium and turned to where there were no people, trying to shake a non-existent person's hand. He's walked around a stage not knowing where he's supposed to stand. He's mixed up words. He's had difficulty articulating his views. He should have had a mental status exam, and it should have been revealed to the people of this country. Nikki Haley's past her prime, but Joe Biden, who was in short pants when Moses was born, he's okay. We don't need to have a mental capacity exam, mental status exam on him. Seriously. The hypocrisy of the Democrats in this country, it knows no bounds. Absolutely, it's just stunning. Nikki Haley's past her prime. Dianne Feinstein is about to turn 90 years old in June. 90 years old. And she's still a senator. She finally announced her retirement the other day. And when asked about it by reporters, she didn't remember that she had announced her retirement. But she's in there voting. She's supposedly representing the people of the state of California in the U.S. Senate. She will be 90 years old in 4 months. She will be 91 by the time she leaves office. But Nikki Haley's past her prime. I'll tell you who's not past her prime. An elderly lady here in Florida who was in her home, and a 64-year-old man just broke down the door and barged in there, and this lady pulled out her gun, shot him dead. Shot him dead, protecting herself, protecting her home. One gunshot wound. Didn't need to double tap. Didn't need to empty her clip. One shot. One shot. Apparently the guy had been harassing this lady with erratic phone calls for days. Her and another female who lives nearby were being harassed by this guy. And I don't know if he lost his mind or if there was some other background issue. He burst into her home. And this lady had her 90-year-old mother, who was an Alzheimer's patient, living in the house with her, and decided she had to protect her mother, she had to protect herself, she had to protect her home. One shot. Took this guy out with one shot. Hats off and applause to those who are able to defend themselves against those who want to harm them. I hope to heaven I never get into that situation. But I know who my examples are if I ever do. Well, you spent another hour listening to my voice, and we want to keep this country free. I thank you for joining me. Next week we'll have more for you. And I hope you're enjoying this show because I sure am. Bye now.